So let me begin. Just seeing with the, it seems to be stuck. Oh, here we are. No, now we're good. Okay then. So a little bit about myself. Thank you very much for the lovely introduction. But under the topic of gut health, when I first started working as a consultant dietitian in Australia, as it turned out, I had quite a few medical specialists and doctors sending people to see me because they had various different types of gut health problems. And for the last 20 years, I've seen many, many people from the capacity where they're not feeling well. And it's gastrointestinal issues, and how do I help and how do I fix? But today, I'm really actually happy to be talking about it from a different perspective. I'm actually starting today from where we are now. People who I'm talking to who are existing and are relatively well and perhaps don't necessarily have a gut health problem or don't perceive themselves to, but to now learn a lot more about your gut and the microbiomes in the gut, all of these things from a kind of healthier perspective. But you'll see it's an interesting story, and hopefully it's how you'll see it today as a nice story. I have my tools of the trade, which I use on a day-to-day basis to help people. I'm a consultant dietitian, and I've been talking to people about food for a long, long time. And of course, today, food is going to be the major topic of discussion of the things that we can do to help manipulate our health from a gut perspective. But I do have other tools: sleep physiology and exercise. A big reason why I'm here talking to you from the Brahm Center is our ability to manage stress well and de-stress. And I have done the mindfulness-based practice courses and actively practice this myself. And it's a really, really important part of everything to do with our health and well-being. I have, and there are very important things that we need to know about our hormones, our genes, how our genes are actually switched on and off, our epigenetics, and then the whole world of medications, supplementation, and small molecules that can have a real impact. And actually, not to get too far ahead of myself, but the microbiome, which I'll be talking about a lot, produces an awful lot of small molecules and chemicals that have a massive impact on our body. And I think you'll find that interesting today. So let's talk a little bit about the area that we're speaking. I'm talking about our digestive system, really. And if we think right from the outset, where am I talking about today? And where I am talking is, if you open your mouth, okay, we're a hole from one end to the other. And literally from the moment that you chew food and swallow it, from that point onwards, that really is our digestion. And that is, in a sense, our gut. But there's lots of different compartments to it. And I'll be talking about all of those different compartments later on. Because today, the overall theme, the beginning theme was well-being and health, I wanted to start at the brain and talk about our digestive system and how it directly communicates with our brain. And some of these things are obvious, but also fascinating. When we eat food, for example, we have stretch receptors in our stomach, in our small intestines, our large intestines. They know the volume of food that is coming through, and they're telling the brain what to do. Do we need more? Do we need less? We have these mechanical stretch receptors. So already we know that our gut is communicating to our brain in a very direct manner. But then even more so than that, the food that we eat, it breaks down into carbohydrates and sugars and fats and amino acids. And then we have all of the antioxidants that we find on the skin of colorful fruit and vegetables. Those molecules, so many other molecules as we are eating and digesting food, those molecules are communicating with our body. So the nutrients are communicating with our body, and the cells in our body are producing hormones and all sorts of chemicals that send many, many signals to all different parts of our body, and very much so including our brain. Interesting that we have hormone signals that tell us when we feel full, hormone signals that are telling us that we are still hungry. There is a really interesting medication that has hit the world by storm with respect to weight loss, called it's called a GLP-1 agonist. Well, that is essentially a hormone that our body makes in response to food that actually tells our brain that we're not quite so hungry, turn down appetite. But then even more recently, we've now discovered that we have cells located all along our digestive system that connect to neurons and have a direct link to our brain. And these are very, very new, very, very new area of neuroscience. And these cells are called neuropods. And this now means that we have almost an instant electrical signaling where the body and the breakdown products of our food are sending signals in a direct link electrically up to the brain and switching on and turning off all these neuromodulator signals. Ones that we've all heard about, like dopamine, and which makes us feel a particular way. It tends to make people alert and to make decisions and to make action and actually to feel good. And then we also have another one called GABA, which when that gets switched on in our brain, it brings on a nice feeling of calmness. Everybody will have heard of serotonin, which helps to regulate anxiety and makes us feel more inwardly calm and happy and of raised mood. We now know that our food is making these signals directly to our brain. So absolutely, there is no doubt that the food that we eat is having an impact on how we feel, how we think, what our mood is like. And in fact, our body can taste, right? And it's quite likely, well, it is, it's happening below our even conscious level. So our brain and our bodies are communicating and telling us what we're liking and what we're not liking subconsciously. Eventually we realize, but that's to the extent this communication is occurring between that entire tube of the body and our brain. But now we've also discovered that the bacteria that live in our gut, so they live in a symbiotic relationship with us. They too produce chemicals which can now have, again, signaling in numerous ways that I had never even imagined. And when I researched this talk today, some of the signals that our gut microbiome is sending is having impacts not just to our brain, but to so many different cells in our body and organs and systems in our body, that we almost need to think that our bacteria is existing in our large intestine is a wealth of chemicals and information and signals to all parts of the body. So let's talk a bit more about the microbiome itself. So what I'm talking about are all of the bacteria and fungi and viruses that reside on all of the surfaces of our body that are exposed to the outside world. So our skin, of course, is covered in microbes and bacteria. And our ears, our nasal passages, they're everywhere. And then, of course, all the way down through the body, which I'm going to talk a lot about today. So the bacteria themselves are called the microbiota. The microbiome is all of those bacteria plus all of the products that they then make. Because remember, these bacteria have got their own genes, they're making proteins, they're making chemicals, and they're being output into the body into these different compartments. And as I'll talk about later on, we have multiple different compartments, and that becomes the total biome. And people basically talk about microbiota and microbiome interchangeably. These bacteria play an incredibly important role with us. So they're in, hopefully, a nice symbiotic relationship. And the bacteria themselves are involved critically in how we digest food. They produce, in their own right, very, very important nutrients that our body can't make, but our body needs. They have detoxification protocols and processes in them. And then they also have an immense role in our immune system, which therefore means they're involved with inflammation and anti-inflammation in our immune function and our overall health. So the microbiome is extremely important and provides a rich array of functions and chemicals to us. So let's talk about the microbiome and the gut in a little bit more detail. And as I said, what compartments are we really talking about? So it's interesting if we think about our mouth to begin with. So if you think, what's the environment of the mouth? We have a microbiome in our mouth, but what's the environment here? Well, there's a lot of air because we're breathing. So whatever bacteria live there need to have good, need oxygen. The bacteria, a lot of them are living on the surface of our teeth, and our teeth are used mechanically. So the bacteria need to be all nicely packed in and unable to move. And they don't really have access to broken down food because we're eating large amounts of undigested food. So we have a certain amount. There's some bacteria there. And then our whole digestive system is kind of closed off by different sets of sphincters. So once we swallow food and it's now sitting in the stomach, there's bacteria there as well. But what's that environment like? Well, it's a highly acidic environment. Food is always passing through. So there's large periods of time where there is little or no food in the stomach. So there's not as many bacteria located there. But there are some, and some of you may have heard of a bacteria called Helicobacter pylori, which can form nasty ulcers and be contributing to stomach ulcers. But there's biome there. Our small intestine, the next compartment, our small intestines. Well, a lot happens in the small intestines. Our body is investing a lot of effort in the small intestines to absorb nutrients. And so there are certain nutrients available, and a lot of sugar and carbohydrates are digested at this point. So there's sets of bacteria here. But the one that everybody really is discussing when they talk about the gut and they talk about the microbiome is the large intestines, the large section where a lot of the nutrients have already been digested, and it's that final stage of our digestive system. And first of all, we know it well because we can reach it. So when people make waste, about 60% of the waste that you produce is actual bacteria and microbiota. So it's very easy to access and to look at and to analyze. So scientists can go there. It's much harder for scientists and researchers to look at what's happening in the small intestine, for example. It's where the bulk of the bacteria live. And so there's literally hundreds, tens or hundreds of trillions of microorganisms here. And they all have residency there in different ways. Some of the bacteria are living on the surface of the lining of the large intestine, which is covered in a mucus layer. Some of these bacteria are moving around from one place to another. They're densely packed. As I said, the majority of the bacteria in our large intestines are located there. There's 2, 3, 4 kilograms of bacteria in this point. And so the environment there's a lot of bacteria, there's lots of different chemicals, there's a constant supply of certain types of nutrition. And so this becomes this sort of thriving colony, and people liken it to a zoo. And we build that colony of bacteria right from birth. So when you are first born, you are basically a sterile being in this world. And from the moment that you are born, you are starting to develop what your microbiome will be. The type of delivery that you had, the hand contact that you have had, who your carers were. If your primary carer was your mother, or your mother and your father, the amount of touch that they gave you, whether you were breastfed or not. All of these things manipulate the development of your own microbiome that is there doing its job right now. And if you've had a household of pets, whether you were touched frequently or not, as we get older, were you kissed, who did you kiss, all of these things. And in fact, the first 3 years of our lives is really where our microbiome is firmly established. And from 3 years onwards, our biome generally is very stable for the majority of our lives. And I'm going to talk about what happens towards our lives as we get older, because I'm very interested in longevity, and the microbiome plays a role here too. But for young parents and for us living in the COVID age, there's this sort of risk benefit to think about. We want to expose our very young children to a range of different microbes, and to have your child come back from playing outside and making the decision, do I ask them to wash their hands before eating dinner or not? You can almost think, well, they were playing on the ground, and maybe their hands have got a little bit of dirt. Well, that's very different from whether they were on a set of swings, and what they've been handling might not be the most appropriate. Or now the COVID world that we live in, where everybody is washing their hands and sanitizing. We need to really think about that. So if there are young parents or people who are going to be having children soon, that first 3 years of life is really, really important to developing what kind of microbiome your child is going to have. And then, of course, as we are older, what type of medications we take, how often we had antibiotics, the kind of diet that we consume shapes this microbiome. So, which then leads to the question, what is a healthy microbiome? And it's actually really hard to get a clear answer as to what that might be. What we do know is that we all have an incredibly unique signature, which is what our microbiome is. So we all have a lot of variation, first of all, and that microbiome for each of us functions in a particular way and is very much unique. We do know that our microbiome is extremely malleable. You take a course of antibiotics and the gut biome is going to change. You make dramatic changes in your diet and your eating patterns, the microbiome changes. What we also know is that it does seem to have quite a good memory, if you want to call it that. If you take a course of antibiotics, over time, your your biome tends to go back to what it used to be. And we know more a lot about it. So there was a huge project where scientists were very interested in sequencing our human genome and understanding all the genes that the human genome has. And it was a successful, enormous project. And then with that technology, basically when that project finished, scientists were wanting to look at other genomes. And so they started to look at the microbiome. But there is something like 100 to 400 times the amount of DNA and DNA in the microbiome as there is in the human. So there's an awful lot of work. But they've started to do that, and they've looked at all the genes of various microbiomes to start to understand various signatures. What does this microbiome look like? And so big data, big research, first of all, looked at modern hunter-gatherers. So the various groups of individuals that still live a hunter-gatherer life here in current times, and started to look at what their microbiome was like. And part of the reason is to say, well, these are groups of individuals that don't have the chronic diseases that we have in our industrialized and westernized world. They don't have the diabetes and the heart diseases and the neurogenerative decline as we as a population do. And they were looking to say, does their microbiome tell us something that's different? And what we've found from the hunter-gatherer types is there is something. They have a very much diverse microbiome. They have a lot of different types of bacteria and fungi and viruses in there. They have a lot of what we call diversity. And when we look at our Western industrialized individuals, we have a completely different signature. It looks completely different. And are we just seeing our microbiome looks different due to our different circumstances? Yes. But what we do know is our biome is less diverse, tends to be a little less stable. And there is a school of thought to say, is our baseline microbiome already somewhat compromised just by nature of the lifestyles that we lead that are so different from the hunter-gatherer? So there is this thought that we're already, as westernized and industrialized populations, we're on the back foot here. Now you can, because it's 2022, you can find out about your own microbiome. We've got tests and testing kits, and Singapore has some companies that are local that will analyze your microbiome for you. I can do it with, again, various companies where we send sample out, and you can find out in quite detail what your microbiome looks like and discover whether or not it's considered to be in or out of kilter. I have to say, though, it's a lot of information that is generated from here, and the bacteria and the microbiome is, in a sense, a real frontier. So the information that you get and how you choose to analyze it is really up to very interesting interpretation, but we can find out. So if I had to say something about what is a healthy microbiome, is the likelihood is the more diverse it is, the more stable it is, that would indicate somewhat that your microbiome is in a healthier state. So if we think that in a sense, as a population, we're already on the back foot just by being westernized or industrialized, our biomes somewhat reduced in diversity? Are they somewhat unstable? Well, what we do know is when we look at different health conditions, that in fact, when you look at people with heart disease and diabetes and carrying significantly extra body weight, neurodegenerative neurogenerative decline. These diseases of modern life also correlate to reduced diversity. And so maybe there is this element of truth to this. We also know that as we get older, our diversity of our microbiome also decreases as a function of age and time. And what brings about that instability? Well, scientists have looked and they've studied when you get infections, what you choose to eat, what you choose not to eat, the kind of exercise that you do, whether you do very little or more, all of these things have an impact on our microbiome. If you sleep, compromised sleep, again, has an impact on the microbiome that brings you back to this side of lack of diversity and lack of stability. The more medications you take, your exposure to antibiotics. Okay, so the things I'm talking about here, modern life. So there's the concept of our microbiome actually being in what we would say dysbiosis. Is there an imbalance of our microbiome just by being westernized? And what is that? So are there not so many of the beneficial biota that are producing, again, chemicals and signals that are important to our body and to promote health? Do we have more of what they call the pathogenic bacteria, the ones that are producing chemicals that perhaps signal or have more of a toxic nature? And then very much so is our microbiome, our compromised microbiome, promoting inflammation. And this is something I'm going to talk about quite a lot. And again, if we have chronic inflammation, that has a real impact on our immune system. And those health conditions that I'm talking about, heart disease, diabetes, neurogenerative decline, hypertension, the one thing they all have in common is that they're all very much diseases of inflammation. So does our bacteria in our large intestines really have perhaps more of an impact on our health than we had ever thought? So what we do know is the bacteria in our large intestine, our microbiome, play an incredibly important role in our immune status and immune function. And then it comes back down to just think about your body for a moment. Talking about our large intestines, what's there? Our body is breaking down so much food. And this is the primary point where a whole lot of undigested products are. So many different food types are here. How much foreign matter and what we call antigens are located in that spot. So many. But our large intestine has a job to do. It has to take nutrients from that large space and put them into this lovely sterile environment, which is our bloodstream and blood supply. But there's one layer of cells that is protecting the outside world, that luminal space where all the bacteria are, and our inside world. There's a single set of cells. As I said, there's this mucus layer. So not surprising. Whereabouts is most of our immune cells? They're there, located in and around this bag of bacteria. Because in that large intestine, we need these bacteria. They're playing an extremely important role. But we don't want them in the wrong places. And so our immune system is really working very hard in that area. And the bacteria and our microbiome are playing an extremely important role. So what we do completely understand is just how critical the microbiome is in maintaining our immune function, but also can contribute to a breakdown in immune function through chronic inflammation. So we talk about autoimmune diseases and their links back to the microbiome, but it's more than just that. So if we have in our industrialized and westernized world a baseline microbiome that is a reflection of how we eat and live, is that microbiome itself setting us up to be teetering on a more pro-inflammatory state? This is the question. And if that is the truth, then what can we manipulate? We can manipulate our diet to manipulate our microbiome. And so this comes to a phenomenal part of this all is that we do have the potential to control our microbiome in a very positive way. And there was a very big, interesting study that had quite an impact on the gastrointestinal research world. We talk, and anybody will have had told us all 1,000 times that we need to eat more fiber, and fiber is good for our gut. Well, a big study was done to literally ask that question, because it's easy to do studies on humans on food. But this same very big study also looked at fermented vegetables and their impact on the microbiome. And they were expecting, when they did this study, that increasing fiber was going to be the be-all and end-all. And they were interested as to see what would happen with fermented foods. And they were very, very surprised by the results that came from it. What they discovered was that, and I'm going to talk about fermented foods in a minute, is that when they looked, it was actually the people that consumed the fermented food that had the most drastic positive changes to their microbiome. They discovered that the consumption of more fermented foods created far more gut microbiome diversity. But they did blood sampling of these people, and they looked at inflammatory markers, and they found a significant decrease in inflammation and inflammatory markers from consuming fermented foods. And they discovered that the more that you ate, the better the result. And the longer that you took these sorts of foods, the better the result. And what are we talking about when we're talking about fermented foods? It's, again, lower sugar foods generally that have got live microorganisms built into the food. They've been fermented. So you can buy yogurts, for example, not the sweetened ones that have a lot of sugar and additives, but ones when you eat it, you can actually taste the sourness of it. Well, that's because there's live culture in there. And then kimchis and sauerkrauts and actual fermented vegetables, natto, there's live cultured cottage cheese, there's kefir and kefir waters, and then lots of drinks, the kombuchas and water kefirs and switchels that are actual live bacteria in the food. So these are real probiotics. And it is these foods that made the biggest difference on changing the microbiota. Now, there's some things that are important to remember here, is that real fermented foods like this, they've got to be refrigerated. So if you're buying something from a can, or if you've said, great, I'm going to buy something pickled, but it's at room temperature and it's in a jar, first of all, it's probably just sitting in the brine to make it taste like the fermented food, but it's not actually fermented. So there's no probiotics in there. If it's been canned, then it's been irradiated, which means that even if there were probiotics there, they're no longer there. So we're really talking about live culture, absolutely live culture. And so I like to practice what I preach. So I'm a Westerner. I didn't used to routinely eat fermented foods. And about 6 months ago, I made the decision that every meal I'm going to have just a little ramekin with some fermented vegetables that I buy from the refrigerated section of the shop. what we do know that we need to do is slow and steady wins the race here. And I'll talk about this a little bit more in the minute, but I already have a particular type of microbiome. Just because I start layering things on doesn't necessarily mean my microbiome likes it. So small, steady amounts. In the work that I did to research for this talk today, and I looked at that study, I realized I'm probably not having enough of it. So today, when I did my shopping, I've bought 2 jars. And so now I'm going to have 2 serves with my dinner at night. And I, in fact, bought some of this yogurt that I know is going to taste tart and not sweet. And I know my children are not going to be that excited by it. But as time passes, I'm going to slowly get them used to that change in flavor. And I'm going to try to find ways to get the probiotics to my children. And I'm now doubling or tripling up myself because the information is so strong, and I'm really wanting to make these sorts of changes to myself. So that's my first very, very big point to suggest to people today. If you want to look to manipulate your microbiome in a positive way so that you can build diversity and create some stability and maybe start to make a simple change that could have a real impact on your health, the fermented foods is a good start. So then that large study also talked, and they were expecting the idea, if you eat a lot more fiber, the same thing should happen. Or in fact, they expected that it would be so much more. And yes, we do like and want and need a higher fiber diet, but this is interesting. So carbohydrates get a very bad rap, okay, due to highly processed carbs and sugars and the like. But we also have carbohydrates that are very important, and they have a name now, microbiota accessible carbohydrates, MACs. So not your Big Mac, but your Mac, the different one. Now, these are complex carbohydrates that we don't digest. So the host, the human, doesn't digest, but they find their way to the large intestines, and they're made available to the gut microbes, and those gut microbes do the fermentation process, and that fermentation process results in some very, very important nutrients. So as I said, the microbiome is producing very important nutrients for us. But they're also doing all sorts of other things, not just fermenting. Okay, they're going to also take some of these carbohydrates and do other things with them. But what we know, well known, are the breakdown of these indigestible fibers, producing these short chain fatty acids, produce compounds like butyrate and propionate and acetate. And what do? Well, they play an incredibly important role in maintaining that intestinal barrier. So remember, as I said, we've got one set of cells plus some mucus that's separating the outside world from the inside world. And if you start to have a breakdown of that mucus and a breakdown of that intestinal integrity, you're going to have too much movement of the wrong types of things across into that bloodstream. And this is where we have the compromise of health and chemicals being sent across to the body, signals being sent across to the body. So we know that they play a real role in looking after that barrier, making sure that that mucus layer, hugely important, is there, protecting against inflammation, modulating that whole immune response that is there, and really big things like protecting us from certain cancers, colorectal cancers. So if I go back to the hunter-gatherers, the modern hunter-gatherers, and the sequencing that they did of the microbiome, what they discovered is, what is the lifestyle of the modern-day hunter-gatherer? Well, they do, yes, like to go out and hunt. And given half a chance, they're going to eat a lot of meat and they'll eat sweet things just like anybody else. But the truth is that most of their hunts don't work. You don't get that much success on a hunt. So they end up eating a ton of plants. And in fact, they're eating about 60 to 100 grams of fiber a day because there's no choice. Our Western diets, typical American diet, maybe 20 grams worth of fiber a day. So they have a very, very different microbiota. It's part of what they do. And they also have a huge amount of fiber. We tend not to. And so where do we get these MACs? So it's coming from plant. So vegetables and fruit and whole grains and nuts and seeds and legumes, real food contains real MACs, and the microbiome basically needs them. But this is where I think something is interesting, and this is where the study showed things that were interesting, is that we already have a particular microbiome that's essentially adjusted to the life that we lead, and we might actually feel okay, but it's not very diverse, and it probably should be better. And so then you start to take on board some of these, and there's no guarantee that our existing microbiome is ready to take on board some of these additional ones. And so what they've discovered is that something that might work well for somebody is going to give someone else real gastrointestinal issues. And this is when I see people, because they start to take on a really healthy diet and it feels terrible for them. So you have to learn to pick and choose and look at your broad spectrum of your eating patterns, and take on board what can I handle, and what sits well, and how slowly should I do it. And this sort of process really should be a slow and steady process, not sort of a dumping of all things that are supposedly good for you. So I think that's really interesting. But it was the fermented vegetables that actually gave a more universal result than these. So yes, we absolutely must have our fiber, but we also need to realize that we have this individual signature of what our own microbiome is and which things can we take on board and not. Then for the last 8 or 10 years, I've been really interested in the idea of longevity, living healthier longer. Can we extend not only the healthy period of our life, but the length of our life? And so the microbiome really does play a role here. And so what we've done is, when scientists look at a far more aging population, they've discovered that the microbiome is relatively stable, as I said, through the majority of your adult life. But as you become older, and particularly towards the real latter part of your life, is the amount of diversity really drops. So if you're already starting with a not very diverse group, it drops even further. And what actually happens is that certain what they call unique microbes start to show in larger numbers. And it's more so that if you had this pool of many diverse bacteria, a lot of the major players, for, if you want to call it, start to fall away. And what's left are these more unique ones that get an opportunity to thrive. And the people who live longer have more of the unique microbiome. And so it's this increase in rare species of microbes that, again, might be having a real contribution to our health, particularly as we get older. But it's like starting out with a lot, and by the time you're much older, you might have a little, but you still might have a lot, some of the good ones. If you're starting with not much in the first place, then a lot less or none as you get much older. So again, it comes back to this idea of preserving your diversity, because it's a bit like being a 50-year-old male and saying, I've got my last chance here to put on some lean muscle because it's slowly falling away. and I want to have as much credit in the bank for when I get older so that I stand on this planet strong. It's almost like that with your microbiome. So in summary, the things that I think that are important is, first of all, what we do know is we have a very strong gut-brain connection, that when we talk about food making us feel a particular way, it's probably very, very much true. And there will be foods that you can and can't eat that can manipulate how you feel, your mood, your state of mind. So there is no doubt that that connection exists. That our early years set a trajectory to what our microbiome will be like. And that I think I've made a good case for us to all realize that these bacteria that form 4 kilograms of mass in our large intestines are playing an incredibly important role. And this is all happening now as we sit here, but not even at a conscious level. That the mass of bacteria is having a huge impact on controlling our immune system, and that there is this idea that we have a baseline microbiome, and that if it is more diverse and the more stable that it is, the healthier it is, and that might help with us with combating or better managing health and disease. I had a really interesting way to think about things now is if we talk about diabetes or heart disease and the things that you can and should be doing, is to say, hang on a minute, I've also got to realize that the microbiome is actually playing a role here as well. What else can I do? And it's like that. And I was finding it really hard to understand that carrying extra body weight, for example, could really have a big, that your microbiome is playing a role here. But some of the readings that I had were fascinating, that what they've discovered when people gain weight and lose weight, the same person, and they see all these changes in their blood chemistry and the like, that the change in the microbiome sometimes is actually not that much. And that the state of that microbiome, when you're in a heavier state or a lighter state, there's enzymes from one and chemicals from one that can actually find their way through the bloodstream to the fat cells, and they're telling the fat cell signals. So I'd never really thought that you could get signals from a microbiome that's talking to fat cells to saying, yes, I can use or store the information that I have there. So it's another signaling place that's telling us about the balance of our bodies. So many different health conditions are going to start to probably be discovered, that the pool of bacteria is having a massive impact. So fermented vegetables, it's my food message for the day. How can you eat more fermented vegetables and to do it in a manner that the body likes, with the way that the taste buds like, and so that you're doing this in a slow and steady manner? Finding out which MACs are right for you. Which ones can you take on board that are going to help? And that there is this overarching rule that if you're doing this and you're doing it well, it might be contributing to your health as you age. There's a famous author and food advocate for natural eating who really made the case, which is as simple as it is. Eat food, not too much, mostly plant. That actually answers what should we be doing for improving our microbiome, real food. So when I was talking about the MACs, it's simple. If you recognize it for what it is, it's real food. That means that it's a lot less processed or not processed at all. How can you eat less processed food? It's going to set you in the right path already. Don't overconsume. The more plants you have, because everything that I talked about today is stemming from the plant side of things. I know that we have a lot of time for talk, and there are topics that I haven't brought up, but again, these are things that people in the audience might be wanting or thinking about. I've talked about probiotics today from fermented food. And in fact, I was talking about prebiotics because that's what fibers are. So I discussed probiotics and prebiotics, but I didn't talk about supplementation. And then we can think about what happens when you fast or have periods of intermittent fasting. What does that do to the microbiome? What does a cleanse do to the microbiome? What do certain food types like artificial sweeteners do to the microbiome? So many. Now, I don't have answers for all of these, but these are some interesting topics that perhaps some of the audience would like. But it certainly sets the tone for the next 20 minutes of talk. And thank you, everybody. It was lovely to share this talk with you today.